Hello and welcome back to Starmergeddon, TLDR's UK politics podcast. I'm your host this week, Georgina Finley, and I'm joined by TLDR's UK politics sage.
Whoa, another one.
That's good. And the birthday boy.
Yes.
Ben Blissett.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Very good. Very good. There's nowhere I'd rather be on my birthday than on the podcast.
Yeah,
so
and there's nothing you'd rather happen in your birthday week than English local elections.
They're
right?
the most fun thing to happen.
There you go. That's your plans.
Yeah, just reading endless things about the local elections. It's such a fun day.
Amazing. And that is also, incidentally, the subject of our podcast episode today.
Well, would you look at that? Yeah.
Almost as if I knew it was coming up. So with that, let's get into it. Do you want to just start off by explaining what the local elections are, why they matter, and any other kind of top points you get from this week?
So I think the main thing to note is that there's a number of different elections happening across, it's mainly England in the next, tomorrow on. So we're recording on Wednesday. The elections are taking place on Thursday, the 1st of May. So there are basically three different kinds of broad elections. So we've got, as you mentioned, the local elections, which are a number of councillors being elected. It's about 1,700-ish councillors across England in a number of different areas. So they will elect about 24 councils as a whole. We've also got a number of mayoralties. There's 4 mayoralties going up for election. So they're regional mayors, also known as metro mayors. And
these are new positions that have been created.
There are 4. So 2 of them are new, 2 of them are pre-existing. So there are also 2 separately elected mayors. So there's one in Doncaster and one in North Tyneside. They are slightly different to the other mayors that we've discussed, and there's a lot less polling on them, so it's harder to actually tell what's going to happen. So we're not going to address them here. And there's a Westminster by-election in Runcorn and Helsby. So if we take those in turn, obviously if we start with the local elections. So as I mentioned, there were 24 councils up for election of the 317 councils, and that accounts for, as I say, about 1,700 councillors. Now, of these, we have one. So, as it stands prior to the election, one of these are Labour control is Labour controlled. 16 of these are Tory controlled. One of them is independent controlled. So that's the Isle of Scilly, which is complicated for a number of different reasons we won't get into. And we have 6 that have minority control, and 3 of those are sort of minority Conservative administrations. 3 of these are minority Lib Dem councils. So that's as things currently stand. So the main thing to note here is that there are 16 Tory majorities that are up for election. So there's a lot of Conservative councils that are in this local election up for election. As we already know nationally, the Conservatives are not doing very well at all. Their polling has completely collapsed. In fact, the last time that these council elections were being voted on, there was the national equivalent vote share. So obviously, the last time these councils were up for election, it wasn't all councils. So if we sort of extrapolate out nationally, 40% voted Tory, 30% voted Labour, 15% Lib Dem, and 15% other. So there was a high Conservative vote share last time. Obviously, as we know, at the minute, the Conservatives are polling at about 23%. So their polling has completely collapsed versus the last time these local
Which would have
council
been
elections.
4 years ago?
Yes.
So 2021.
I believe so, yes. So we're expecting the Conservatives to do pretty badly. There has only really been one big poll that has been conducted. So it was by Electoral Calculus that did an MRP poll. Now, off the bat, I do want to say there's a number of sort of methodological issues with doing an MRP poll for local elections, again, that I won't get into. So take this sort of with a massive pinch of salt. But they are predicting 0 Labour majorities, which is fine. I mean, they only had 1 anyway, so they're losing 1. Labour aren't polling particularly well, sort of as expected.
So this is out of the 24 councils up for grabs.
Yes.
This MRP poll is predicting Labour to lose the one that it has.
Correct, exactly. So again, previously the Tories had 16 majorities. They're predicting 3 Tory majorities.
Wow.
So quite a big loss. We will get back to that. It's not actually as bad for the Tories as it sounds. We will get back to that in a second. Mm-hmm. They're predicting 4 reform majorities, so that's pretty big. And then they're predicting 16 sort of minority or coalition administrations. So of those 16, 7 they're expected to be Conservative largest party. So again, in that situation, the Conservatives could govern as a minority administration in those councils. They could form a coalition with someone else. We don't know what they'll do yet, obviously, because the election hasn't happened. So that would be 7 where the Conservatives are the largest party, 5 where the Lib Dems are the largest party, and 4 where Reform are the largest party. So as things currently stand, just to make it a little bit simpler, there are 16 Tory majorities, but 3 additional on those where the Tories are the largest party or in a coalition agreement. So that would be 19 where they're either the largest party or they just have outright control. So that's 19. The poll, the electoral calculus MRP poll, puts them on 10. So it's almost halved, I suppose, which is basically in line with their vote share. So, last time they were polling at about 40%, they're currently polling about 23%. So it makes sense that they're basically halved. I think the most interesting thing of all of that is the performance of Reform. Now, we already know that local elections are usually used as a protest vote against the incumbent government.
Yeah. Small
parties tend to do well. UKIP did well previously, especially in EU elections, which obviously don't take place anymore because we've left the European Union. So it's not too much of a surprise that we're seeing Reform, that it's predicted that Reform's going to do particularly well. I think the interesting part here, though, is that, and we'll get onto this in a moment, it's not only these council elections they're predicted to do well in, and if they do well across all 3 kinds of elections, then that's going to be not only quite a big story, it provides the momentum. We've discussed this on the podcast before, but when donors are looking at who to give money to, one of the things they'll look at is how they're polling, and more importantly than how they're polling, whether they can actually translate that polling into tangible wins in certain places. And this would be one of the first demonstrations that not only are they polling really well in the sort of like Westminster polling, but they're actually able to translate that into tangible power in this instance, council seats and actually winning councils. So that is one of the biggest sort of takeaways, and I expect will be much of the media narrative after the election, if that proves to be correct, that Reform are able to take councils from the Conservatives. It will be that this sort of momentum is with Reform and that this polling is actually correct.
Right. So I'm wary of us jumping around too much. Do you want to move on to talking about the mayoralties now?
Yeah, let's go through.
And then we can go back to the kind of longer term rise of Reform, a bit of context there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Okay, let's go on to the mayoralties. So what are the polls saying? What are the mayoralties up for grabs? And yeah.
So, I think this is a bit more, obviously the councils are quite confusing everything. The mayoralties are a little bit easier. So there are 4 regional mayors, or as I say, sometimes referred to as metro mayors, up for grabs tomorrow. So we've got the West of England and Cambridge and Peterborough. So they're 2 separate regional mayors. They already have mayors currently. And then we've got Hull and East Yorkshire, which is a first time sort of election for mayors. It's the first time that they have that, and Greater Lincolnshire as well. So we'll go through those one by one. So we'll start with the West of England, because that was the first one I went with there. So the West of England actually already has a mayor. So that was Dan Norris. Now, he's been in the news recently, and for particularly grim reasons.
And this is Labour.
He's Labour. He was part of the Labour Party, so he was a Labour mayor. He was then suspended. He's now Citizens Independent. He was arrested a few weeks ago on rape and child sex offences, was kicked out of the party, and is obviously not standing for the election. So that obviously is a particularly sort of tricky incident. At the minute, YouGov actually puts the Greens out in first on 27%, then Helen Goodwin for Labour on 23%, and then, interestingly, Aaron Banks of Brexit fame, he funded a lot of the Brexit campaign in 2016, running for Reform UK in third on 18%. So it looks like Labour could be unseated here by a Green mayor, no less. So I think that's a particularly interesting one to keep an eye out for. Again, shows that the performance of smaller parties, shows that the Greens are actually able to capitalise, I suppose, on Labour's demise in the polls since they were elected. So just to be clear, West of England already had a mayor. Dan Norris, Labour, now sits an independent, could be unseated by the Greens. The other mayoralty that already already had a mayor is Cambridge and Peterborough. So Nick Johnson, Labour again. And this might be one of the only sort of points of light, I suppose, for the Conservatives. YouGov is predicting that they're going to win the election, and resoundingly as well. 32% for the Conservatives, 20% for Reform UK, and then 19% for Labour. So again,
so polling suggests Cambridge and Peterborough could be a Labour to Conservative swing.
Yeah, which again, considering everything, all of the other conversation about the Conservatives, looking at how they're doing in basically every other kind of election, and particularly nationally, it is particularly impressive that they might be able to pick up a mayor from Labour. That just is quite exceptional.
And how are Reform polling in Cambridge and Peterborough?
They're in second on 20%, so ahead of Labour, but behind the Conservatives by about 12 points.
Okay.
So, yeah, they're looking okay, but it looks like the Conservatives could sweep up there. So we'll move on to the two new mayoralties. And I think these are the two really interesting ones. So we have Hull and East Yorkshire and Greater Lincolnshire. And these are particularly interesting because, as I say, we haven't had any elections for the mayoralties yet. And the polling for these two are actually really interesting. Now, I'm from Hull, I'm from East Yorkshire. I have family members that will be voting in this election. And it's been quite interesting, sort of narrative and discussion over there. At the minute, Reform UK are polling really well. They're polling at 35% with the Lib Dems second on 21%, according to YouGov. So they're doing really well there. Now, it's notable that they have selected a former boxing champion, Luke Campbell, who won gold at the Olympics previously.
Is he a local man?
This is the thing. Local man from Hull, really popular as a result of his success in the Olympics. Really, really well known in the area. A lot of my family already knew him before. Yeah, local celebrity, exactly. A lot of people knew him before he started standing for Reform UK. So it looks like this sort of star appeal is something that Reform are definitely going for, and considering that polling, it seems that that it's doing really well. I think Reform are trying different things, and they've not really got anything to lose, and they're trying to see what could work for them. They're polling particularly strongly, and what they need to do is try and attract people's attention. It's a classic sort of, I guess, populist move is going for big celebrities, big names. Look, I don't need to give any particular examples. Everybody sort of knows this about populists, that sort of star appeal is something that they very much rely on, and it looks like they might be doing that in that election. And as I say, if the polling is correct, it looks like it might be working for them. If we move to the Greater Lincolnshire election, we see that is also true there. What they've done is that they're going with Andrea Jenkins, who was quite senior in the Conservative Party up until she lost her seat in the general election last year. She's since defected to Reform UK and is standing to be the Greater Lincolnshire mayor tomorrow on Thursday. Again, the polling is very similar in Greater Lincolnshire. Again, it's the first time that they're having a mayoral election. It's the sort of inaugural election. And Andrew Jenkins is polling at 40%, which is huge. And then we've got the Conservatives in second on 25%. So it looks like in both of those mayoralties, Reform UK could be winning. And I think, again, when I'm saying about they're trying different things, they're trying a Tory defector. And if she wins that, what it will demonstrate to Conservatives is that if you do want to jump ship to Reform, there might be electoral benefit to that you might be put up in an election that you are very much able to win, and that you will be rewarded electorally for doing so. And I think that's a particularly important sort of argument that Reform can make, and that they can look to Conservatives and they can point out, they can use that as a demonstration of why they should
further defections.
Exactly. So I think that's one to keep an eye on. But again, that polling is that's such a massive lead. That's a 15-point lead. So again, if that YouGov polling is correct, that is huge for Reform. So winning big in councils, it looks like, according to polling, again, tenuous polling, but if that ends up being correct, they could win big in locals, and 2 of the 4 mayoralties, and the 2 new ones at that. So that's pretty big. Yeah. So they're big on the council. So that's the first thing to note, is that the Lib Dems have controlled councils in East Yorkshire before. And I was actually speaking to a family member recently about that. And they were saying that from their perspective, the Lib Dems were really good at the head of the council. So it just is, the Lib Dems are very much quite a local party. They're known for their work on councils and the East Yorkshire. Again, this is just going from one particular family they're speaking to, sort of particularly liked because of their actions in local government.
Interesting. Yeah, not two parties that you think of seeing at the top of the poll.
Not when you're looking at Westminster elections, but when you're looking at smaller elections, Lib Dems are quite popular.
Okay, and finally moving on to the third set of elections taking place tomorrow, which is the Runcorn
and Helsby.
Yeah.
So it's the Runcorn and Helsby by-election also taking place. And that is taking place because of a resignation from Mike Amesbury, who is a Labour MP who you might remember was sentenced on the 24th of February to 10 weeks in prison for assault, which was reduced to a suspended sentence on appeal.
This is the Labour MP who punched a constituent.
Punched a constituent, yes, after a pub trip. And then after his sentence, he was then eligible for a recall petition. But before it got to that stage, he resigned as an MP. So that triggered a by-election, which is also taking place on the same day. Obviously, he isn't standing, so it's a different candidate for Labour standing. He won quite resoundingly in the 2024 general election. He won 52.9% of the vote, which was, again, that's not only...
Mike Amesbury,
yeah. So it's not only a sort of...
it's also it's outright majority.
It's just outright majority, yeah. But the polls now are suggesting that Labour might not win. And I'll give you one guess as to which party might win this one.
Is it Reform, Ben?
It is Reform. Yeah, it is Reform. So they are predicted to win 40% to Labour's 35%, with all the other parties down at around 10%.
That's closer polling than we've had in the other instances, though.
It is closer. But just when we're looking at this in totality, that means that, if they win the by-election, they win 2 of the 4 mayoralties and they win a significant number of councils, this would be a pretty clean sweep for Reform UK. And again, not only gives them another seat in Westminster, which is significant. Obviously, they'd only go back up to 5 because they lost Rupert Lowe as a result of their argument last year. So they go back up to 5 MPs. But that is significant. It shows that again, it's just this demonstration that momentum really is with Reform UK, and that this national polling, this polling that we keep seeing of them bouncing around on similar numbers to Labour and the Conservatives, and in certain instances even ahead of the two parties, can actually be translated into tangible results and will persuade, donors, will persuade Conservatives who want to defect, all of this. It's not so much these individual results on their own are particularly significant. It's this, it's the combination of all of them together builds this media narrative, and just so far it's just numbers on a page, and people are skeptical of polls for a number of reasons. But when you have actual results from actual elections, it changes that from being a hypothetical to an actual tangible thing. And I think that is the main takeaway of all of this. And in that instance of the by-election, it actually, it increases their power in Westminster and gives them another voice on the green benches.
To pull back from that a bit and zoom out and think more long-term, and also think more ahead towards the next general election, is there a risk, you've been writing about it this week, that this polling about Reform, and even if they do very well in the 3 sets of elections taking place tomorrow, is there a risk that this is all being overhyped by the media? And is there an argument that this is just a set of protest votes against the political establishment or against Labour or the Conservatives that won't then translate into MPs and electoral gains on the national level when it comes to the next general election? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, there is definitely an argument, and it's hard to see exactly which way it will go. I mean, just to be clear, I mean, as we've said, with these kinds of elections, we expect smaller parties to do well. We expect smaller parties to sort of stick the knife in, really, to the bigger parties who are annoyed, especially because usually when governments get in, they do that unpopular stuff early in their term, so voters don't remember it nearer the actual election. So Labour are particularly unpopular at the minute. So there is that. I mean, what you would also expect, though, is that on the national level, the main opposition party to be benefiting from that downfall, so the Conservatives, which isn't really happening. So that's a point in
that's
Reform's.
A good point.
That's a point in Reform's sort of defence. But I mean, it's not unusual historically for third parties to have moments where they do really well. Usually they fizzle out, and that is basically the main argument as to why they're overhyped, which is that there's been not too many, but there's been a number of occasions sort of post-war where, in the 1980s with the SDP, 2019 with the Brexit Party, where they sort of rival the main two parties. And then for whatever reason, they sort of fade away. And the main reason for that is just the nature of first past the post benefits to the two main parties. And third parties tend to do really well when the main parties collapse. But the thing about the main parties is that they're so ingrained in the political system. They have so many backers. They have so many local advocates. They have such a sort of presence in people's minds when you're thinking about politics that it's really hard to break that sort of two-party duopoly. And it tends to come back to the two main parties. There was a fear in the 1980s that the SDP could upend Labour. That didn't happen. There was a fear in 2019 that the Brexit Party was polling just as well as the Conservatives. They then stood aside in the 2019 election for the Conservatives, and they never really regained that polling. All it takes is for the main parties to regain that trust, and they might not do it in the short term, but usually in the long term they do, and usually voters go back to those two main parties. Now, realignments happen. In the early 1900s, it was the Liberals that were the main opposition party, and then Labour came on the scene, and they became the second party. It is quite possible for that to be reform. So for that reason, maybe the hype isn't there. But usually, on the whole, those third parties go back down in the polling, and voters go back to the two main parties.
Yeah, but I mean, I can't call which way it's going to go either. I think what is interesting to me, though, is that Farage has said, I think he was quoted in the FT this week as saying that the Brexit Party, UKIP, had very specific goals which were achieved, and then the parties kind of vaporized. That's not his word, that's how I am interpreting it. And he says that this time his very specific goal, which, let's be realistic, he has achieved in his political career in the past, is to get reform into government.
Yeah, but I would take what he's saying there with a pinch of salt. UKIP did obviously achieve Brexit, but it's not like they dissolved the day that the UK voted to leave. If UKIP had polled better, there's no way he would have left UKIP. Like, he can say that. That's a very convenient argument at the minute. But if we're being totally honest, UKIP still existed for years after the Brexit vote. Farage was still involved for a little while afterwards. And if UKIP had polled better, there's no way he would have left. So it's not. I understand what he's saying, that for voters, there was a particular sort of focus, I suppose, on Brexit with his previous outfits. But no, I don't know how much I sort of buy that argument.
All right. Well, something to follow in future. And it'll be very interesting to see the results when they come through. And we'll make sure to bring you further updates on the UK channel next week. So make sure you're subscribed if you're not already. Now, before we get on to our next section of Starmergeddon, which is our cabinet review, we've actually just posted out our new edition of Too Long. This is our 4th edition. It's on the world's top 25 most influential people. Farage didn't make the cut for the top 25. Was that an oversight? Let us know in the comments. And buy a copy if you haven't already, and recommend it to everyone who's interested in people or politics or things happening in the world, because this one has a really broad appeal, I think, and it's definitely our best produced and best written yet. So,
I also think if you're watching this podcast, you clearly have an interest in politics. You clearly at least have an interest in UK politics, and there is quite a large UK section that goes through all different kinds of parties. In fact, there is a very well written piece. I don't know if I can say who by, but there is a... Do you reckon we can
say who by?
Yeah. By Laura from Politics Joe.
Yeah.
Really well written, discussing Reform UK. So if you're interested in that, there is a particular section in there on that. There's a big UK section, and obviously there's all of the other stuff in there on the most influential people. There's a global section. There's all different kinds of stuff in there. So I think if you're watching this, it's definitely the sort of magazine for you.
There you go. Wonderful bit of promo for us there, from us there. And now we'll move on to our cabinet review, which this week you can introduce and then I'll speak.
Yeah, it's Yvette Cooper.
It is Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary.
Indeed.
And we're talking about Yvette Cooper this week in relation to hype around a potential UK-EU youth mobility deal, i.e. bringing back free movement for under 30s. And the reason this has... So since the election, this concept has kind of come in and out of the news and the headlines, and Starmer at first very clearly ruled out a return to free movement, explicitly ruled out a UK-EU youth mobility deal in October. And then towards the end of the year and in the first couple of months of this year, I think January, February time, there were a few reports coming out saying that Starmer was actually considering agreeing to one. And it now appears the case that some kind of youth free movement deal is firmly on the table. And this is all ahead of a key summit between the UK and EU on the 19th of May, at which various issues, trade, defence, security, youth mobility will be discussed. And it's also expected that some big announcements will be made at this summit, notably on the UK-EU Defence Pact. That's the main point of this summit. But, you know, as an aside, it's also possible, or even likely now, that we'll get some kind of free movement deal. And this is interesting because the reason Yvette Cooper and Starmer and the Labour cabinet right now were opposed to some kind of deal was because in their manifesto statement, there is a clear sentence that says there will be no return to the customs union, the single market, or freedom of movement. And to bring back freedom of movement, even if for under 30s, could conceivably be deemed a manifesto breach. So Labour were very wary of this, and they were also wary of how this could be used against them by opposition parties, particularly by Reform UK, arguing that it's reversing Brexit, or it's bringing more Europeans in, or it's, you know, opening up another opportunity for people to come to the UK illegally and stay here illegally over time. But that just doesn't seem to have translated in how the electorate feel about this scheme. There's some interesting polling done in March by Best for Britain think tank, who revealed that in every single UK constituency, including Kemi Badenoch's constituency Northwest Essex and Farage's constituency Clacton, support for some kind of youth mobility scheme, either a 2-year or 4-year scheme, outweighed opposition. So among the electorate, it's actually very popular. And my interpretation of that is that people don't see this as something that's interacting with immigration in an uncomfortable way, but they actually just think this is an opportunity for young people. Yeah, why not? I'm in favor of them being able to, you know, go and spend a few years living and working in Europe and vice versa. So we'll see whether it will happen.
Yeah, I think just very quickly, I think the reluctance from Labour is just that obviously with it being a reciprocal scheme, that the immigration figures would go up as a result of it, and that could be quite uncomfortable for them when they're really trying to demonstrate to the public that they're tough on immigration and all this. Even if you ask people and say, would you be okay for some people from Europe to come over if we, you know, allow our young people to go over to Europe, that they'd say, yes, that's fine. I think that's a reasonable thing. You could also ask them, do you think that this rise in, and they'll go, no, that's not okay. And I think it's just that Labour are scared of those sort of headlines. And I think that does demonstrate a lack of sort of, I guess, integrity is probably a fair phrase. Because I think on the whole, MPs, at least previously, were in favour of those sort of agreements. And it's just that they're scared of these sort of headlines.
Yeah.
So I just say it'll be really interesting to see what they actually agree to at the
summit. It will. And thanks for bringing me back to Yvette Cooper, because I actually forgot to mention why we're talking about her, but this is because she was reportedly the biggest critic of a youth mobility deal within Starmer's cabinet for the reasons you've just explained. Yeah. But she's since said that she'd be open to a deal on a one-in, one-out basis.
Yeah.
So we'll see. All eyes on the summit on the 19th of May. And with that, let's come to the final part of our podcast today, which is the extra story. And today, Ben, you're going to be telling us about a new bike law.
Yeah, so this was it's an amendment to the crime and policing bill, and the government has agreed to the amendment, so it will definitely go through. Basically, it's this new idea that there's going to be sort of a new offence of causing death by dangerous cycling, and I think that this is a thing that didn't receive that much media attention, but I think it's quite interesting to see how the government is approaching this. So this new law will mean that if you cause death at the minute before the amendment goes through, dangerous or reckless cycling is usually punished with a maximum of a 2-year jail term. If you cause death by dangerous cycling, as a result of the law change, you can be sentenced up to 14 years in prison. Now, I think that obviously that's quite significant, but I think what it shows, and I think that there's the criticism that I have of the approach, not the particular law. I think the particular law is, I can understand why the government are pushing it through. I think I can understand that there's been a number of cases in the last few years where this would have made a large a really big tangible difference to the families of the victims. I think I can understand why this is going through. I think it's just that it's a very quick rush by the government to almost like an end point. I think that they're not approaching the issue here very well. I think that there's a lot of changes that could be made before that I think need to be made. I think the issue is that cycling just isn't treated in this country with the same sort of responsibility as driving, for instance. There aren't very many laws actually against cycling. I think most of the laws actually come from, there's a 1988 Road Traffic Act where there's sort of three separate pieces of, sort of three separate offences that people can cause while cycling. One of them is like drinking, like being under the influence of drink or drugs while cycling. But the actual the laws on that are not very robust. So, for example, there's Slater and Gordon lawyers have explained that although it is an offence to cycle under the influence of alcohol, a police officer can't force you to provide a breath, blood, or urine sample. They can ask, but you can refuse, and subsequently, and if you are subsequently charged for being under the influence, the CPS aren't allowed to use your refusal as evidence against you. So there's just so many things of like how you act while you're cycling that will not, that you're not being punished for. Your actual actions and the responsibility hasn't really been addressed. It's just this sort of end point. There needs to be like a culture change, I think, with
a culture change with cycling.
I think that's fair to say. I think there's
what culture change are you after?
Well, I think the responsibility. I think it's mainly the responsibility. What the government are trying to show is that you have a lot of responsibility with your actions and consequences with cycling, and what they're not doing is trying to crack down on the actual things that cause this. I think if you really do want to reduce any of these these deaths, you need to change how people actually approach things, and I don't think that this is going to do much. I think there needs to be more things leading up to it that they haven't really changed yet.
I suppose if you're a cyclist, if I'm embodying a cyclist and I'm arguing back against you now, I'd say I'm the victim here. I'd say more of my lot are killed every year by dangerous driving and drivers, which is why that's criminalized so much more harshly than, I'm not going out there to try and kill people.
Well, nobody goes out
I'm not saying
to do
anyone's
anything.
going out there to kill people.
And that's fair, but that is exactly why there's so many laws with driving. But just because there's still a responsibility with that, there are still people killed by cycling, and if we are trying to crack down on it, I think that there needs to be more sort of top to bottom reform rather than just this end point.
Interesting. And with that, let's bring this episode of Starmergeddon to a close. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode. And in the meantime, you should look out for our coverage of the local elections, mayoral elections, etc. Yeah. And that's it, I guess. So
there will be a UK video on the elections this week. I don't know exactly when it'll be coming out yet. If you check the TLDR News UK channel, there will be an explainer going through all the elections, what it means, and whether Reform actually did manage to pull it off, and whether they managed to win in all three.
Yeah, all eyes on Reform. And with that, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks for joining.